And Elton Hall will now speak to us about Francis of Assisi. Welcome, Elton.
Forgive my voice tonight. For some reason, I seem to have gotten some sort of sniffles. My daughter's teaching in an elementary school, so lots of interesting things come home. Francis of Assisi. I didn't have the ability to put together a PowerPoint this time, but I do have a statue of St. Francis, which is probably very familiar to most of you. You'll notice he's holding a bowl. There's a bird on the side of the bowl right here. And at his feet are various animals. This is just your typical garden statue, which captures something of the way people have felt about St. Francis for centuries. As Helena Blavatsky noted in the Theosophical Glossary, Theosophia is, and I quote, the substratum and basis of all the world religions and philosophies, taught and practiced by a few elect ever since man became a thinking being. In its practical bearing, Theosophy is purely divine ethics. Theosophy is its expression, the expression of Theosophia, as made available through HPB in the 19th century and continues today. HPB indicated that individuals may be considered Theosophists at several levels. In the most inclusive sense, any individual who has the welfare of others at heart and thus embodies goodwill is a Theosophist. For such a person reflects in some degree the very injunction given in the Voice of the Silence to aspirants to the highest truth possible for a human being. To live to benefit mankind is the first step. To practice the 6 glorious virtues is the second. At a more precise level, a Theosophist is one who joins a theosophical organization, or at least studies theosophical teachings with the sincere aim to learn from them and to put them into practice and to put into practice their implications. At an even higher level are those who aspire in consciousness and action to tread the path of discipleship and eventual adeptship as set out in the Voice. One finds throughout history figures, many of whom were initiates, like Jesus, St. Paul, Plato, who taught Theosophy in language, symbols, and analogies suitable to the cultures in which they appeared and worked. And there are many whose deepest spiritual aspirations opened them to intuitions of the truth of Theosophia and to masters who could help their understanding without interfering with individual or collective karma. We hesitate to call Mahatmas Theosophists because they embody Theosophia at a level far beyond the 3 just mentioned. Francis of Assisi, canonized as a saint by the Church just 2 years after his death, is such a natural Theosophist, though in his life he was an early 13th century Catholic. His chosen life was for the few, but it was typical of those few who were often hermits and lone sojourners preaching a doctrine of penance. He was exceptional in his idea of penance, for he sought more than personal salvation. He sought the regeneration of all. His penance is that to which the Voice of the Silence admonishes. Thy soul has to become as ripe as the ripe mango fruit, as soft and sweet as its bright golden pulp for others' woes, as hard as that fruit's stone for thine own throes and sorrows. But it wasn't always so in the life of Francis. He was born in a moderately wealthy merchant family about 1181. At this time, the rapidly emerging merchant class dealing in money was undermining the old feudal order in which land ownership constituted both wealth and status. His father was absent on business at the time of Francis's birth, and his mother named him Giovanni. But upon returning home, his father renamed him Francesco, after his love of all things French. Francis received a decent education, where he was expected eventually to inherit and manage the family's merchant business. As a young man, Francis was known for his fun-loving sociability. Running with the privileged youth of Assisi, he was dubbed King of Revels, though he did not engage in rough or violent acts. What he lacked in nobility, he could make up for in paying for the entertainment and forays of such youth. During his early years, Assisi was annexed to the possessions of Henry VI Hohenstaufen. Upon Henry's death, his lands fell to others, and the Pope managed to reclaim Assisi. The town, however, resisted autocratic control, dismantling its fort, causing the hereditary nobility to flee to Perugia. That town then demanded compensation for the losses of its new citizens. And rather than pay, Assisi went to war with Perugia. It lost badly, and Francis, as a member of the losing army, was imprisoned for about a year. During that time, his good humor sustained his fellow prisoners. After the war, Francis came to feel that he had a destiny to fulfill, though he did not know what it was. Having learned the songs of troubadours and being charmed by the stories of King Arthur and the Round Table, he yearned to become a knight who wedded the role of warrior with devotion to the divine. What he imagined the Crusaders to be, who conquered and were now losing their grip on the Holy Land. As a result, he determined to join a struggle to restore the rightful rule of Apulia in the southern part of Italy. But hardly had he begun the journey south when he fell ill. While in a semi-conscious state, he heard a voice ask him a question. Whom would it be better to serve, the servant or the master? Of course, Francis replied that it is better to serve the master. The voice responded, why do you seek out the servant rather than the master? Francis realized that this was a profound question going quite beyond the players on the stage of Apulia. He asked, what do you want me to do, Lord? He was told to return to Assisi and prepare himself to do what he was told to do there, so he returned. At this point, Francis did not know what to expect, but he had found something deeply significant in himself, even as he lost his more conventional self. At home, he sometimes experienced trances, but maintained an upbeat outer presence, even while wrestling with inner doubts. He bought expensive items to adorn the churches of Assisi, much to his father's consternation, and undertook a pilgrimage to Rome. While attempting to discern his mission, his destiny, as it were, his actions were at this time conventional for the culture surrounding him. He had experienced lepers around Assisi and was repulsed by them. But near the end of his life, he dictated a testament in which he said, and I quote, this is how God inspired me, Brother Francis, to embark on a life of penance. When I was in sin, the sight of lepers nauseated me beyond measure. But then God himself led me into their company, and I had pity on them. When I had once become acquainted with them, what had previously nauseated me became a source of spiritual and physical consolation for me. After that, I did not wait long before leaving the world, that is, renouncing just the worldly life. Seeing that his comfortable way of life was irresponsible in the midst of suffering, he began to realize that the decay of the world was a reflection of the moral and spiritual decay in himself. He would disappear into the hills around Assisi for extended periods, seeking deeper understanding of his mission. When near the church of Damiano, just a little south of Assisi, an inner voice told him to go inside and pray. The Aquarian Almanac for October 30th notes, HPB says that, quote, prayer is an ennobling action when it is an intense feeling, an ardent desire rushing forth from our very heart for the good of all other people, and when entirely detached from any selfish personal object. Such surely was Francis's prayer, for the voice then said, Francis, do you not see that my house is falling into ruin? Go and repair it for me. At this point, Francis took the voice literally, believing that this particular church building should be repaired. He took his father's money to spend on repairs and moved into the church. His father sent a posse to retrieve him, but Francis hid in a nearby cave for a month. When he returned, his father bound him in a cellar, which was a scandal in Assisi. While his father was away on business, his mother released him, and he retreated to San Damiano. Returning, his father demanded that he come home, which he refused. So his father took Francis to court to face charges of expropriating funds not belonging to him. When the bishop ruled that he should return what he had taken, Francis stripped off his clothing and placed his purse on the pile, renouncing any claim to his father's wealth. The story goes that the bishop quickly covered him with his own cloak. Francis was now alone, for even the town thought his actions were something of a joke. But he now saw that if the church were to be restored, he had to do it himself. He began rebuilding the structure with old masonry. But when townsfolk saw this, they donated supplies and even joined him in the work. Finishing this church, he moved on to another dilapidated church, and then a third. When that was completed in 1208, a priest from the Benedictine Abbey came and celebrated Mass. His text was the words of Jesus, to go into the world without possessions and preach penance. For Francis, the penny dropped. This was his longing and mission. He became a hermit. In this period of history, penance meant renouncing the world in the sense of letting go of its glittering offerings, possessions, status, rank, pleasures. But one did not do this only for the sake of one's own soul. The renunciant was to be an example for humanity, thereby igniting the latent spiritual aspirations of others. The voice of the silence tells us to be humble if thou wouldst attain to wisdom. Be humbler still when wisdom thou hast mastered. Francis was feeling his way forward without a map or instructions. But from the beginning, he was humble, and he remained so throughout his life. He did not sternly rebuke those who lived worldly lives or preach hellfire for sinners. Rather, he cheerfully drew attention to the world and nature, reminding everyone that both were good as divine creations. So immersed was he in nature's bounty that people came to believe that he spoke the language of birds. And images of him to this day typically show him with a bird or two perched on his shoulder or on a bowl he holds, as in the image we saw right at the beginning. For him, everything in nature is a sacrament, a manifestation of the divine suffusing the world. Because of his joyous renunciation, others began to be attracted to him and his way of life. When a wealthy immigrant sought to join Francis, he consulted a local priest who randomly opened a missal. Missal is a prayer book and items for the Catholic services throughout the year, who randomly opened a missal 3 times, rather as some people today randomly open the Bible or the I Ching for guidance. The 3 messages were to sell all and give everything to the poor, to take no food or money with one, and to take up Christ's cross and follow him. Francis declared that these 3 injunctions would be the rule of his emerging community, and thus the Franciscan order was born. He called this growing group of spiritual friends the Round Table, after King Arthur's seat, and saw his band as spiritual knights rather than warriors. He wrote a first rule of the order, which is lost to us, but we know that it welcomed men of all backgrounds and was democratically governed. In 1209, Francis and some of his companions went to Rome, where they eventually met the Pope, who approved the rule of the order, thus officially recognizing it, on condition that the brothers preach penance, but not theology. We do not know much about Francis's theological views, for he never wrote anything about them. No one, however, seems to have ever questioned his orthodoxy. We know he found existence joyous, and God a deity of love and compassion. He was in no way a Pollyanna, for he understood suffering and expected it. He would agree with Benvenuto Cellini, who is quoted for November 1st in the Almanac. Who will to know what weal awaits him must first learn the ill that God for him hath wrought. The Theosophist will recognize in this statement an expression of the law of karma. As Francis would embrace the quote for November 3rd from Jakob Burma, a Protestant, of course. The right life is a power of joy, a perpetual well-being and pleasing delight. And this reminded me of experiences some of us had with various Tibetan Buddhist monks who always seem to be happy and laughing despite all the terrible things they have had to go through since the conquest of Tibet in the late 1950s. Francis's order was quite simple: poor, begging, wandering, and preaching penance, chaste, and most importantly, being brothers in spirit. In 1211, a young nobleman named Clare, a young noblewoman named Clare met Francis and asked to be admitted to the order. Francis knew of the problems that had arisen with orders that contained both sexes, and so he arranged for her to enter a Benedictine convent secretly. When she refused to return home, and also refused the Benedictine habit, declaring that she was sworn to the rule of Francis, the town of Assisi was quite ruffled, even though there was no impropriety to expose. Quite soon, her sister Agnes also slipped away and joined her. Embarrassed by the situation, the local bishop gave Clare and Agnes the first church Francis had restored, San Damiano. Francis created the Order of Poor Clares for women and made Clare the abbess. This order, by the way, has a convent right next to the mission in Santa Barbara, California. Francis realized that the initial spirit of his order was waning even as it grew, and modified the original rule, something that has happened in all the religions of the world. At this time, the Muslims were retaking the land seized by crusaders in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Francis thought of preaching to the Saracens. When Pope Innocent III declared a new crusade in 1217, Francis obtained letters of safe conduct and in 1219 sailed for Acre. Once there, he was surprised to discover that the Muslims were more civilized than the Crusaders. And when they decided to forego Jerusalem and instead captured the fort of Damietta in Egypt, he sought out Sultan Melek al-Kamil. The Sultan enjoyed philosophical conversations and invited Francis to join him. The two took to one another, though neither, of course, converted to the faith of the other. The Sultan saw that Francis received gifts and safe passage back to the Crusaders' camp. Returning home, Francis found the order in difficulties, and he wrote a second rule for it. It accepts martyrdom, then celebrated as the highest form of penance, but declared the preferred course for renunciants, living with unbelievers as an example of the pure Christian life. Rather than condemning all other ways of living, he said that preaching penance was persuading people to take to heart what they already believed in some way. His aim was to bridge the theory-practice divide in individuals. His ethics profoundly reflect the paramitas, or the voice of the silence. Upon revising the order and establishing a company of lay brothers, a kind of lay order, those who did not enter the order but tried to incorporate its principles into daily life, he resigned as the order's head and became a recluse. During a fast in 1224, he received the stigmata, the signs of Christ's wounds to hands, feet, and side on the cross, the first male to have ever displayed it. He was so overcome that he had to be carried to his lodging, and he quickly went blind. Even in this suffering, he composed the famous poem to Brother Sun, Sister Moon. As he realized he was nearing death in 1226, he added the praise of death to the poem. Despite all this, he saw himself as a failure because he could not keep the order true to its ideals. But he was a success in what he thought was the highest witness, living by example. He made clear that witness in a brief poem he wrote. This is the poem. You've many heard it probably in various contexts. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Maker, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying to the self that we are born to eternal life. Though we might use slightly different language, this aspiration is suitable to theosophists at any level HPB specified. We recall the words of Sri Krishna in the almanac for Friday, November 4th. In whatever form a devotee desires with faith to worship, it is I alone who inspire him with constancy therein. Francis died on October 3rd, 1226. He was buried in Assisi, still the center of pilgrimage for those devoted to Francis. The cardinal who had given him safe passage on the crusade had become the Pope and canonized Francis as Saint Francis in 1228. And I have the Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon canticle if you would like me to read it or not. What do you think, Jonathan? I can't hear you, Jonathan.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. I would love to hear that. I think
Okay.
it's lovely. Thank you.
It's often called the Canticle of Brother Sun and Sister Moon by St. Francis. Most high, all powerful, all good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessings. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no mortal lips are worthy to pronounce your name. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who is the day through whom you give us light, and he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. Praise be you, my Lord. Through Sister Moon and the stars in the heavens, you have made them bright, precious, and fair. Praise you, my Lord, through brothers Wind and Air, and fair and stormy, all weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made. Praise be my Lord through Sister Water, so useful, humble, precious, and pure. Praise be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, producing varied fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praise be to you, my Lord, though through those who grant pardon for love of you and bear sickness and trial. Blessed are those who endure peace. By your most high, by you most high, they will be crowned. And then this is the one he added quite near the end of his life. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Death, from whom no one living can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are they she finds doing your will. No second death can do them harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Amen.
Thank you, Elton, so much. Yeah, I'm not turning the light on. Yeah. That one back there by the door is good, so. Yeah, thanks so much for that. Wow, thank you very much, Elton. I just had a question. He seems to, by identifying things as nature, in nature, as brother and sister, even death, it seems a way of affirming solidarity. And with these things, it's like the opposite of alienation. It's the embracing and bringing them into the family within his heart, I guess. What would you say, I guess, is the relationship between that and his compassion that he had to, sound like he had to work on it or evolve it or give birth to his compassion?
I think the one ignited the other, in that as he came to feel, I mean, what he's really feeling, he would not use these words, but what a theosophist would say, in a very practical way, he's experiencing what we call the one life. It's just one. Now, in his language, it's because the Creator divinely created everything. So it must all be sacred, and in that sense, have at the very highest level a kind of unity. And I think it was his experience of nature from fairly early on, he was beginning to absent himself from mountains and so on. And the way he resonated with nature, that awakened or reinforced or whatever happened there, his innate sense of compassion. One has a feeling he'd been in these things before he was Francis. But of course, that was not part of the theology being taught at the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Judy has her hand up.
Yes, thank you, Elton, for a wonderful discussion of the teachings of St. Francis and his life. And I'm wondering if you could respond to the idea, do you think there's so many great mystics among the Catholics, such as St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, and others? Origen, of course, is more marginalized, but there are many who have certainly been very central in the Catholic teaching, because the Catholics recognize a unity of the divine, but also a plural divine. I mean, such as the various saints that are praised to. And I know there's this article by H.P. Blavatsky, Star Angel Worship in the Roman Catholic Church. And I know a sister of the Sacred Heart who is a great mystic and open to all religious traditions. And I find this more so among the Catholics than the Protestants. Maybe it's because it's been around for so long. But what do you think of that? Do you think there's something about their theology that's more open? And that's why there are some mystics among them?
It's really interesting. One of the great Protestant theologians of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, in his systematic theology, argues that Protestantism has a principle. And he never quite defines that, but it gets centered around the fact that the individual must come to spiritual realization on their own. And this shows up as, you read the Bible and understand it. You don't have it taught to you by people who are reading it in a language you can't even read. But Catholics have what he called the substance. And however distorted in everything things have become, he seems to be pointing there that they kind of have a sense of the spirit behind the teachings of Christ. And he honored both of them, which is very interesting for a theologian. A book which won't be published until, I think, February next year, but I saw an advanced copy of, is called In Praise of Polytheism by Maurizio Bettini. University of California Press is publishing it, and I was asked to review it. It's short, 150 small pages. But he's not so much praising polytheism as trying to answer the question, why is it that the monotheistic religions, with all their interreligious dialogue and so on, can't seem to get anything going? He says, look at the old, and he only deals with ancient Western polytheistic religions, the Celts, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and so on. He doesn't deal with India. He says, well, look at what happened in the polytheisms. I travel to another city. I encounter a particular god. I learn a little bit about that god and see certain connections with the god in my city. So I may say, oh, this is your version of this god. And so there's a assimilation there. Or it can be as extreme as, this is a new god. We need to add it to the pantheon because we were ignorant before. Or at the most extreme, the Roman Senate would grant the equivalent, the divine equivalent of citizenship to a foreign god, which meant that god could have a temple in Rome with all the rites in the way it would be done in God's original homeland. Hence, Isis comes to Rome and becomes a really important figure there. And he says, what you find with the polytheisms is, to use crude language, they can negotiate with one another. They can accept. They can learn from one another. The monotheisms are exclusive. And he says, look what's happened. We don't give usually a name to God. We just say God. The noun now becomes the name, and it can't be used by anyone else, any other being. Even in Islam, Allah is just Allah, the God. Allah, the God. God. He says, now, there's another thing about the monotheisms, especially Christianity. It's a disguised polytheism, because not only does it have a trinity, but it has all these saints. But because of that exclusivity, it can't admit Muslim saints, right? So it's still blocked off from any meaningful interreligious dialogue, because they all start from, I am right and you're misguided or wrong, or demonic or whatever. So it's just a very interesting idea that he has there of openness versus closeness. But because Christianity got absorbed into and took over the Roman Empire, right? That polytheism becomes what he calls disguised polytheism, because you have all these saints you can appeal to and so on, including now, of course, and since 1228, St. Francis. Protestants don't have that. Protestants speak of angels, but you don't pray to angels. You can pray to saints.
Yeah, I think it's a good answer. And also, I'm glad to hear there's a defense of polytheism, because the worst in the Protestantism being Calvinism, which makes of God a fiend, predestination. So, thank you. Let's move on.
Robert?
I have kind of a superficial question to start with. I wondered if you thought the movie, I think it's Zeffirelli, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon,
long ago, yes.
compared to your account, leaves out a lot. So I wondered if you thought it was over romanticized. But the more fundamental question I have is, it's interesting that he didn't get Francis didn't get into any conflict with the church by maintaining this penance, whereas so many, throughout history have battled over philosophical issues. So, is this a better way to take that stance?
What do you mean, is this a better way?
Well,
You mean just avoiding the issues?
Yeah, in some ways, like an example, he was able to be an inspiration and a help to many people that were poor, and saw a great light and a spiritual presence there.
Yeah.
So, do we need to battle theological issues?
There's probably a certain type of person you can argue into a changed view. But I think, as we see in society historically and today, there can be a lot of argument and nobody changes their position. That's just the way things are. what I recall always being taught in any theosophical discourse in any place I've ever been is you listen to put it in simple language, where a person is coming from, and you meet them on that level. And I think that's what St. Francis was doing. The way it was put was penance as persuading people to take seriously what they already, at least latently, believe. And I think that's just, thinking back over this as putting it together, I was just more struck than I ever have been in my life at how, to me, at a practical level, theosophical he was. And I think we have no theology from him because he just didn't care about that. What you tell me what you're thinking, and then I have a clue where to go from there to what persuade you to something a little deeper, a little higher, right? A little closer to reality, many layers of illusion. And of course, that fits nicely with the old doctrine of absolute versus relative truth. Almost anything somebody says has some truth in it. The question is, can we discern what that is and go from there? Because if we can't, then we're merely arguing propositions back and forth. Laura, I see a hand.
Yes, thank you very much, Elton. The one thing that stood out for me is at the end, the reading that you did, where he shows that all the elements, all of life, come from the same one source. He indicates that very clearly in his reading. And the other thing is, in the way that he worded it, and if we contemplate how he put it into language, we begin to realize that we so much take for granted the fact that there is water, that there is fire, that there is wind, that there is earth. We don't stop to consider them and their meaning in our life, and how the form that we live in is one with them. And so in that way, he shows us what it means to be mystic. What it means to be a mystic is to contemplate that on a daily basis.
He begins and keeps bringing it back to what he called God. But then you notice he's got the sun and the moon, the solar and the lunar. Then he's got the four elements, right? Fire, water, air, and then earth is Mother Earth, kind of doing double duty there. And then, because all of this is perishable, death. I mean, there's the whole kind of structure of the world right there. Very, very interesting. I'm not trying to make him a theosophist, but it's just so redolent with theosophical themes. Even at the end, his statement, for those who aspire to the spiritual life, there is no second death. Now, a Catholic's going to put that in, you're going to heaven rather than hell. But in the early Christian church, there was not a concept of hell. There was a concept of outer darkness. But as Bart Ehrman has argued in a book, and I forget quite the title of it, but it's about the origin of the concept of hell. If you look at the words of Jesus very carefully in the Bible, which is kind of all we've got, and Paul's writings very carefully, It looks like what they're saying is we die, physically. And then at some point, maybe immediately, maybe at some last judgment, those who are pure go on, and those who are not are simply extinguished. There's no painful hell. There's just annihilation. It's only later on that you get the idea that hell is an endless torture of some kind, which has always seemed a little odd. Yeah. And I see Jim's hand.
Yes, it's really when your presentation was very rich and made him really real. There's a kind of existential presence of what Jesus was talking about. It seems to me just almost his whole manner of being was, in a sense, an expression of Jesus. Now, why I say that is because then it raises a question in my mind, Elton. Did he, in his own order, did he believe in or stress at all original sin?
That is a very good question. And since we have no theology, and he was forbidden to teach theology, I have no idea what he thought about that.
The very fact that you don't is significant.
Yeah.
Because if that's
he certainly did not interact with others as if there was an original sin.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, he does not seem to have done that. Very interesting idea.
Because you wonder how he would fit in today if he comes into our world, into America, into sectarianism, into intense ideology, whether it's religion or politics. You wonder how he would, in what way he could be harmonic, or whether he would really be, just by his very nature, be something of a rebel.
Well, he does have that rebel side, doesn't he? His father certainly thought he did. Yeah. Rebel for a higher cause, not for some worldly cause, this versus that, but something else entirely. I think, Monica, was your hand next?
I thought that Dr. Saltzman's hand was up before mine.
No, go ahead, Monica. I've had a chance to speak already. So ask your question first.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Judy. Elton, this was just wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel particularly grateful to hear about his personal life and struggle with family. That really, that made me feel closer to him somehow. This exalted being having to transcend the psychology and the will of parents. It's just, it never occurred to me. So I'm grateful for that. And the other thing is, I would like to know, where can I find that last poem that you read for us that spoke of Brother Sun and Sister Moon? Where do I find that?
Actually, I have it in a book somewhere, and my books are organized like my mind is, which means it's entirely random access. And so I just went on the internet and Googled Brother Sun, Sister Moon.
Oh, wow.
And bingo, there it was. I think it was, there's something which ends with Catholic.org, and they had it, but it comes right up. You don't have to wade through a bunch of stuff to see it. And it's right there. And that's the version I used. Of course, he wrote it in. Good question. Latin or Italian, Latin probably, but so they're slightly different translations, but it's easy to find. Just Google it.
Well, thank you very much. Just a wonderful presentation. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. Marlon?
Hello, Elton. Well, I'm willing to wait for Judy. She always has really interesting questions, so.
Oh, well, I'll just make it a quick question. I wonder if you could speak a little more, Elton, about his love for animals and their love for him. I know the movie shows something that's in the biography of St. Francis by the mayor of Assisi, which is considered hagiography, but it shows the Saracens sending 2 lepers to kill him, but the lepers just come up and lick his hands in reverence and bow at his feet. And he seemed to consider the animals to be our younger brothers. I mean, he invites people to bring all the animals into the church for blessing. Even the farm animals like the chickens and the sheep and such. And he was probably a vegetarian. I mean, I don't know, but it doesn't seem that he would want to eat any animals, maybe fish. I'm not sure, because the Christ apparently ate fish, but yeah, this seems to be very important, that he's inclusive of all living beings and all of nature. And I don't sure if these stories are true about the lepers, but it's very interesting.
Well, he certainly had a connection with lepers. That shows up. But the details there, I don't know. Because part of the order, at least once came the order, was begging, not just like a Buddhist monk. He would probably ate a variety of things depending on what was given to him. That would be my guess. Though, just like with Buddhist monks, as you come to understand, they're probably vegetarian. Not all Buddhist monks are. If you were giving something to a monk, it would be vegetarian. But I don't know. I didn't see anything about that. I'm sure there is, Judy used the word hagiography. That means it's a biography, but it's full of the legends that have risen around a person, and therefore may not be history as we tend to think of it, whatever that is. History as we tend to think of it is a collection of facts. A lot of saints' lives are that way. And I'm no doubt there's a lot of that there. But there's a spirit that goes through the account of his life, which seems to me very authentic. The details I wouldn't know about. And I couldn't find anything on what connected him with animals, except that he lived in nature, and people came to believe that he spoke the language actually not just of birds, but of some animals too. But if you're out in nature and you're very quiet, it's remarkable. I have a little tray outside the house, and I put bird food on it. Of course, more and more birds have learned that it's there. So I put bird food on it 4 or 5 times a day. And there's this little robin. Every morning I come out to put bird food. It doesn't wait like the other birds till I'm gone. It lands at one end of the tray while I'm putting food at the other end, hops over my hand to the end where the food is already down while I'm laying the food. If I were patient, I'm sure I could get it to eat out of my hand. And the chipmunks that help themselves too, I have done that with. So you get that kind of connection if you're just, very peaceful in nature. If you've ever had a cat or a dog, you may have become aware, they seem to almost psychically pick up your mood. They're very observant that way. So it doesn't surprise me that if that turns out to be true, that birds landed on his shoulders and rabbits gathered around him, I wouldn't be surprised.
And wild animals would not harm him. That's the
Right.
what that
Right.
biography says. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Now, Marlon.
Alton, thank you so very much. It's just really clear and beautiful, and deeply appreciate listening to you. My question is, at one point you were talking about will and ill, and it struck me the relationship between illness and willness. And in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10 is about the perfections, just many, many perfections in the animal world and the human world, and certain professions that a person might have, whatever. And so I'm wondering, in this time when will is taken in the sense that this is what I believe, and you're darn right, I will do what I believe, and that's that. And then on the other side, they will do the same. So is there a connection? And I think you touched upon this, but I'd like you to speak a little more about it. The question, the relationship between will in its quintessential sense and ill, suffering, going through hard periods, things like that.
Well, you know, Judge's famous comment, behind will stands desire. And one of the things that people have noticed throughout history is that the individual is a great contributor to the environment they inhabit. And what I mean by that is a person who has a suspicious bent finds things to be suspicious about everywhere. A person who thinks, and I think St. Francis would be one of these, that at heart, people are good unless something overrides that, tends to find good in people, even crabby people, even people who don't seem to like them. So the question is, what is a person desiring? And if we desire something truly more spiritual, two things will happen. I think Cellini got it quite right. Right. There'll be a precipitation of old stuff that has to be handled, because we can't get there without dealing with that baggage. But opportunities arise. And so I don't want to say something, you know, like Dale Carnegie, positive thinking, but the way we see the world, which also means the way we see ourselves, very much affects the world as we will experience it. The hypochondriac is always ill, even if nothing is wrong from a medical point of view.
It's like Jim's got his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, Elton, did you ever, there was a movie came out in 1972, Brother or Son, Sister Moon.
Yeah,
Did you ever by chance see that movie?
I did when it came out.
Does that seem to be a fair enough presentation of his personal life to be something we could recommend?
Ah,
I mean, besides the beautiful lyrics of Donovan, but I mean,
right. Yes. As I reach back in my memory 50 years, my memory is also like my file cabinet. I think so. It was an inspiring movie,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it did have
yeah.
just a slight worldly touch right at the end. You know, the Pope descends from this high throne,
Yeah, that's an
kisses
incredible
Francis's
scene.
feet,
Yeah, Alec
and
Guinness.
this one of these warrior types, churchman standing on the side, turns to his friend and says, "The Pope knows what he is doing. This man will bring the people back to us."
Yeah,
Completely cynical,
yeah,
completely cynical.
yeah.
And so I think the movie really made an effort to try to capture the real spirit of St. Francis. The details, no doubt, fudged here and there, and I don't
Yeah, yeah,
remember
yeah,
the
yeah.
details to know. But I do think, yeah, that kind of spirit that he showed there, as far as I can tell, you know, as I remember, was quite good.
Okay, well, I'd like to recommend, because I know Monica would, I think if you would enjoy it. And it does bring out the spirit of his wild youth without overdoing it, and
Right.
his quixotic, his kind of unpredictable, quixotic nature, his joyousness, his humility. I mean, it does a lot of things like that,
Yeah.
I think. And
Yeah.
that scene with the Pope is just a powerful scene. And it does show you the Jesuits looking at it. But anyway, you might enjoy that. So anyone else, if you could, we know it's there because some of us watched it a few years ago, and found it, very much worthwhile. And the
Yeah.
singing, there's a song in there at a certain point that's just marvelous and powerful, in terms of the spirit of Jesus.
Thank you, James.
Yeah.
I've written it down. I'm definitely going to find it.
Yeah.
If I could interject, I showed it to my class in the 1990s at Cal Poly, and I remember Alec Guinness is the Pope. And the way he does it after St. Francis speaks, he says, "Bring back that man. That's why I became a priest, because he's so bored as a Pope. He's almost
Yeah.
asleep. He's so bored with everybody." And then all of a sudden, he just comes alive like a young man and says, "Oh my goodness, this is why I became a priest, and I'd almost forgotten."
Yeah.
And so it's a very powerful scene. I love the way Alec Guinness does it. And the only thing is that St. Clair just looks like a 1970 flower child. That's the way she's
Yeah.
played.
But we don't want to say too
But-
much about the movie because
But it's a fun movie. It really is good. And
Sounds great. Thank you.
yeah.
We've got to check it out.
I want to hear a full edX report next week, Monica.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Anybody?
Wow.
I maybe remember this.
I have another question. Everything that I've ever heard in reference to St. Francis has always been his relationship with the animal kingdom. I never heard any of what you gave us this evening. And so I'm wondering what the tie is, that is always what ends up being the commercialized take, let's say, on St. Francis. And it made me wonder if it has to do with the idea that the depth and the height of his mysticism somehow gave him a stronger, maybe more intimate connection with this force of evolution, and that part in our time when we are supposed to turn around and help the evolution of that which is behind us, say the animal, and of course the others as well. So is it that he may have tapped in so deeply that that's what people picked up on? I don't know. I'm just curious.
Well, I think it appeals to something that is there in a great number of people. despite the fact we're all busy and urbanites and all of that. And that is that deep feeling, yeah, we are connected to nature. I remember once being told, don't slam that door. There are elementals there.
Huh.
And quite frankly, I try to close doors gently ever since. Because it was one of, well, I mean, as soon as it was said, given what we've read in Theosophy and everything and heard, it made perfectly good sense. That's like the penny dropping just on a very little thing. And so whatever went on in those trances he had and so on, and how, which we don't know, of course, anything about inner experience of others, I think the connection there was very natural, and I'm sure the people around felt it. Yeah. I had a friend who came back and had visited Assisi in Italy and said the place has a light around it. Now it's a huge tourist center.
Yeah.
It's exactly the place I would not choose to go. And so there's a light around it, they felt. Well, I'm sorry, Jonathan.
I just had a question. This might be kind of a big question to ask at the end, but in the 16th chapter of the Gita, there's the distinction between the godlike and the demoniacal nature. And I can't remember, the whole list on each side, but one of the ones that I remember about the godlike is the fearlessness and the love side of it. And I was wondering if you could talk about that relationship. It just seems like that Francis of Assisi just effortlessly embodied that connection.
Very interesting comment. Well, as HPB says in various places, fear, or as Professor Iyer would often say, fear is always for what? The very personal self. You can't be afraid for the higher triad.
Yeah.
For the personal self.
Yeah.
Love in the deepest sense has to transcend the personal self. And so if you are really of a loving nature, I think it's only natural that fearlessness comes along with it. We can have very personal attachments, which we may call love, but I'm thinking of it in the deeper sense, like the voice calls compassion and so on. If we really had that, there was obviously a certain lack of fear in the things he did. The story I didn't tell, because it may be, again, hagiography, was when he met the Sultan in Egypt, he was permitted to approach the Sultan only if he crossed a floor which was covered with crosses. Crosses are sharp and pointed. If he crossed them barefooted, and he did, and was unhurt. And then the Sultan said he had to cross, and then Francis offered to cross a floor of burning coals with a Muslim with him. And if either one emerged unsinged, the other would convert to the unsinged one. The Sultan wisely pointed out that the Quran forbids such tests. But, there's stories like that. But pretty clearly, Francis had a very fearless streak, to first go off on a crusade,
Yeah.
decide on your own to go and try to see the Sultan. Remember, they're at war. They just conquered a fort. So it's just, yeah, I'm sure where compassion is deep, fearlessness follows quite naturally.
Well, thank you very, very much, Elton. Thank you for doing this and for transmitting this subtle teaching to us so effectively. And I think for demonstrating really the highest aspects of the second object, because you fused it with what I would call the kind of the noetic side of the third object, which is really the path, and all in the service of the first object of universal brotherhood. So I thank you so much for putting this beautiful presentation together. So, and I would just mention before we go, speaking of fearlessness, we have Dr. Jean Jennings, who will be presenting on Mahatmas and Karma in a week from today. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you so much, Elton.
Well, thank you for inviting me to think about St. Francis again, which I've done for a long, long time.
Thank you,
Quite
Elton.
rewarding.
Well, we got the
Terrific meeting, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alton.
Thank you, Milton.
Yeah, namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Namaste, brothers.
Have a good week.
Thank you.